Here I'm wiping sawdust off these 4x8 sheets of 1/2 inch thick plywood that I had a big box store cut into 6-inch widths. Here I'm priming with Zinsser's Bullseye 123 water-based primer for all surfaces. It's really their best primer. I find that when I prime them first and then lightly sand them with a 220 sandpaper, that the surface tends to be a little bit smoother. The disadvantage to priming them first is that occasionally a little splinter of wood will appear where you just rolled. You have to pick it off with your hand and then you have to re-roll it. The directions indicate an hour after you paint with this primer you can put a second coat over it. However, because we're lightly sanding it with a 220 sandpaper, I waited until the next day. And here I am the next day lightly sanding with the 220 sandpaper. After sanding, I'm putting a second coat of primer on. Once that's dry, then I'll install it. To prepare the wall before shiplapping, I used the same primer, and then I did one more coat with a top coat of a semi-gloss pure white paint.
So what we need to do is locate our studs so it's easier once we start hanging our shiplap. We know exactly where to strike our nails. Typically studs are 16 inches on center, so you can find a stud or two and then just measure. You can double check with your stud finder. Okay, so we know our granite countertops can vary in width, close to an inch. So this is 6-inch shiplap or faux shiplap. So I think it's going to work out if we start at the top and go down. And once we get on this bottom piece, I'm going to not put the bottom piece on so they can slide the granite counter in and then the shiplap will go over it in a thin bead of caulk. So I'm trying to make this such that the bottom piece will be ripped slightly to fit here. So we got to make sure that the gap at the bottom for that last piece of shiplap above these countertops 6 inches or less. So there's different ways you can do this. Some people start basically at the floor, or here it would be at the countertops with their 6-inch shiplap, and they would start it after the countertops slid in. But I want everything kind of painted and cleaned up before the countertops come in. I don't want to have to worry about a mess and so on. So I think we can do this, with our measurements such that we come down here, and then when we put our shiplap here, we go all the way to the wall. And there's different ways you can do this too, but if we go all the way to the wall, then we're down about 1/2 inch. Shiplap is 1/2 inch plywood. So then we're going to go down with our shiplap, and like I said, we'll just have that probably about 5 3/4-ish on that bottom piece. Okay, so to shiplap, how I do it is you want the shiplap level. So the ceiling there is actually level, which is pretty unusual for a 50-year-old home.
I also want to give you a heads up, when you use your nickels for spacers, you don't want to pinch them too tight between your shiplap boards, because what I found is sometimes the shiplap can kind of move a little bit as you're nailing it in, and every once in a while you can't get the nickel out, or if you do get the nickel out, you have to force it out, and then you're going to not have a nice straight even line between the shiplap boards. You're going to be able to tell that something was kind of jammed in there a little bit. It's going to be off. It's not quite straight. You can do the math to calculate the width of the shiplap, and you can try to do it such, working at the bottom, that your top piece is going to be the same width as your bottom piece. But again, in an older home that's crooked, it's really hard to do. So I like to start at the top. That's more eye level, so all the pieces going down are the same. Then that bottom piece of shiplap is going to be a little bit narrower than the other pieces. And there's going to typically be a piece of baseboard that's going to cover that up. I have found that using a Dremel for the cutouts works the best.
Okay, so when I do the sidewall, I don't actually use any nickels for the spacer because what I find is when you put the board on the corner here, I got this board, these two boards to match the best I could. And so now I'm going to put the level underneath. And rather than using nickels for spacers, I'm just going to make sure this is level, and that's where I'm going to install it. And I'm actually off a little bit so the crack is wider here than there. So I'm just going to kind of go the best between two worlds. I just use drywall spackle, and I just dab it on my finger. And I just fill the hole, and then I just brush it off. Rub it like that. So I found that if you put the spackle in, and you just brush it away, it works fine. And it's a whole lot easier than just putting a blotch there and sanding it later. So on the edge here, as you can see, it doesn't matter if we got these, even or not. We're going to actually take a trim piece and put it here.
After cutting off 1/3 of this cabinet, moving it over to the right and leveling them, I just put the top piece of shiplap up against the level and nailed it in. And then using nickels for spacers, I just worked downward. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to finish all my brush strokes going the same way into the paint that I just painted. So what I try to do is not to use too much paint because I don't want to get a lot of paint gobbed in these cracks. Okay, so this is 1/2-inch plywood, and because there's some bowing, which is random throughout this project, I'm having to do some vertical rolling. But again, make sure if you do that, that you have not too much paint on here and that you finish up with all your strokes going horizontal, preferably into the paint. So we did make a video on the advantages and disadvantages to some different materials for shiplapping, or I should say faux shiplapping. So see that. We have shiplapped 3 different rooms in our house, so I would refer you to see that first before you start shiplapping. So if you like this video, you want to see more videos, please subscribe, hit the bell.